Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first weekend of the second part of Beyond Bohm, Science, Art, and Creativity. We'll be focusing on contemplation and creativity. I'm James Barbieri, Associate Program Director of the Power Center, and I'll be your host for today. As a host, I'll be helping you throughout the call, so any problems, technical or not, just feel free to just drop me a message in the chat. Before we begin, I'd just like to go do a bit of an overview of a couple of rules for this session. First of all, we ask participants to turn off their microphone during the presentations and discussion to ensure a good quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if you hear any background noise, but this is not to silence everyone, it's just for audio reasons. But at the same time, we do encourage everyone to turn on their camera, as we believe seeing everyone's faces and reactions creates a nice, inclusive educational environment. During Q&A and discussion, if you want to ask a question, you can either use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which can be found at the bottom of your screen under reactions. Otherwise, you can physically raise your hand, and if I spot you, I'll call out your name and you can ask your question. If you're feeling a bit shy though, you can ask your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. Regarding the chat, you will only be able to message the host during the presentation and panel discussion to ensure a good concentration, but the chat will be opened up to everyone during the Q&A. If you would like to share something with the group during the panel discussions, do message us, the hosts, and we will be able to share this with everyone with the recordings after the session. Finally, all sessions are recorded for archival purposes and for you all. As always, the recordings will be available 3 days after the session, and you should all receive the link then. If you haven't received it, just let us know and we can help you out. And now, to begin the session, let's hear a few words from the chair of this event, Lee Nicol. Welcome.
Thank you, James. And let me just extend a warm welcome to everyone today. It's delightful to have all of you here and that we're beginning finally this wonderful extended program that we have around so many aspects of David Bohm's work. We've been working at it for months now, and the day is here, we're beginning, and we're so happy that you're joining us. Let's see, let me first of all recognize and extend thanks to the previous program, Beyond Bohm 1, and all the marvelous work that they did, which really provides a basis and a counterpoint for what we'll be doing today. That group included Shantana and Basil, and Emily, and Pavo, and Giuseppe, and David. So thank you all for what you've led us up to for today. So I think most of us here know how fully David Bohm has been recognized as a physicist and the work that he did over many decades. And maybe many of the group here today also know how much work and inquiry David did outside of physics. But in the wider world, it's not too clear how well known he is for the many areas that he worked in. So that's what our Beyond Bohm 2 program is for. It is to open up a number of those areas. And these will include his explorations into thought, human thought, and its impact on humanity, and how he worked with that in dialogue. And it's particularly, I think, not that well known how interested David was in the meanings and aspects of all different kinds of artistic expression. And that's what we'll be opening up today. There's also his longstanding interest in the nature of imagination and the many levels that are involved in his own work and other things he explored with imagination. He really spent a lot of time looking into the latent potential of language, and especially what we can learn from indigenous people and indigenous cultures about how language shapes and forms our sense of reality. So that's a sampling of what we'll be working with in the next 6 sessions over the next 3 weekends. And we have a wonderful array of people that are going to be opening all these questions up. So once again, welcome. I hope you find something and maybe many things of value over these next 3 weeks. So back to you, James.
Well, thank you, Lee, for your words, and it's great to have you as a chair for this event. So today we are honored to have the first of a series of panels that will explore Bohm's thought and philosophy. Today we'll be looking at creativity and the artist. Today's panelists are led by Hester Reeve, who is an artist based in the UK and a reader in fine art at Sheffield Hallam University. She's been working with Bohm's ideas and dialogue for 20 years, and her artwork have been shown in a variety of international contexts, including the Tate Britain. So welcome, Hester. Hester will also be joined by Jessica Ball, a freelance facilitator and knowledge management consultant. She's currently applying for a PhD in ecolinguistics at the University of Gloucestershire. Hello, Jessica. Also, we have Alison Churchill, a UK-based artist interested in exploring the creative process beyond the individual. Hi, Alison. And finally, we have Emma Cocker, a writer, artist, and associate professor in fine art at the Nottingham Trent University. Her writings have been published in Failure, On Not Knowing, How Artists Think, and the solo collection, The Yes of the No. So very warm welcome to all of our panelists. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Hester. Welcome.
Thank you so much, James. Hello, everybody. I'll be sharing my screen with a PowerPoint. I'm only going to talk for about 15 minutes, really just to set out a few key ideas. At least they seem key to me as an artist who's very much inspired and provoked by Bohm's work as it relates to creativity and art. But I think the real richness will come when I get into a round table discussion with Emma, Alison and Jessica. So we'll get into that very soon. But I just thought it'd be really good to lay some grounding ideas and also to look at some artworks as well. Not that that's an easy fit being quite a key word when it comes to art and Bohm. And I think that's exciting. I think it's quite exciting that it's not straightforward to say, oh yes, these were his concerns and ideas and here's fitting an artwork, because he's actually so insightful and challenging that he's opening up at least what I see as important questions and openings for art that I think various artists and other disciplines have possibly followed. But it opens art up so much that this idea of a neat definition of an artwork isn't really what he would talk about. And I've noticed as I read his works that he very carefully uses the word art form. Now, he'll use the word artwork when he's talking about a painting, for example. But most of the time when he's talking about his preoccupations with art and its overall importance, he will say art form. Now, of course, what's interesting about this is that, and he does himself say, for all his care after art, the artist is no special person, no more special than any other kind of person. And as much as I'm completely passionate about being an artist, of course, I would agree with that. So there's these really openings as to what we mean by art. And if we really want to talk about artwork and art labor, that doesn't necessarily have to lead to an artwork. It does a lot in my practice, but not the whole practice. And that's something I very much enjoy and learn through. But David Bohm is talking about something far more philosophical and far more artful in my notion. Anyway, I'll go to my PowerPoint. I picked out a few quotations of his that I just think are super exciting. I'll try and elucidate them, but I'm not so good at that. And I'm sort of more Well, hopefully I can make it resonate for you, shall we say that? But I don't like this idea of pulling things apart and information, and I know exactly what they mean. So hopefully I can just enliven them a little. So let me just get to my PowerPoint. Oh, first of all, I have to share screen, don't I? Okay, James, it's saying to me, it's not showing me where I can share screen. It says one participant can share at a time. Does that mean you have to let me share?
Does it work now? I've changed the settings.
Oh, you've done it, you magician. Thank you. Right, let's go to the beginning. Right, if I can just find, sorry, I'm sorry people, it's so awful when people fiddle with their technology, but now it's not letting me, 1 second, I'll be back with you in a minute. Going into slideshow, play from start. Thank you. Now then, let's see if I can. I'm just having to switch to get. No, it won't do it. Anyway, that's fine. I think we've had that before, haven't we? Where it won't let you do the whole slide, but hopefully we can, you can see that okay. There will be a few slides just with quotations. I know that can sometimes be a lot to take in. There's not that many. They're just key ones. First off, I think it doesn't get said enough that Bohm, for all the kind of constructiveness of what he writes and talks about, he was always constructive. Ideas, no matter how abstract, always became linked to practice as well somehow, and how these things have ramifications for us as living creatures with bodies in a society, in a cosmos. But he also has this really sharp criticality that I think links to a kind of brute honesty. And I think that brute honesty is not something we use enough with each other. So I like the fact that he actually doesn't think that we express our creativity enough. And he was worried that the creative possibilities of the mind are generally dormant, due possibly to a deep and widespread confusion between the creative and the mechanical. And this confusion means it is very hard to even perceive that one is not creative. I think we can make lots of assumptions that so-and-so is creative or this thing is creative, and it's not that they're doing anything bad, but that, you know, what is true creativity actually? And it's not as simple as making an artwork or going to art school, because quite possibly the habits of our language and our thought forms and the very world of culture that we have created might unwittingly cut us off from those creative possibilities, because ultimately Bohm sees creativity and what he calls creative intelligence as not originating inside us in the human mind, but these are sort of forces of nature, of the sort of non-human world per se. And then another key quotation for me that I just think is beautiful, and shows this wonderful merging of art and thinking and philosophy and language with David Bohm, where he says thought with totality as its content has to be considered as an art form, like poetry whose function is primarily to give rise to a new perception rather than to communicate reflective knowledge of how everything is. And as an artist, I do have this sort of ongoing practice of reading philosophy and working to not just understand, but what are the repercussions of reading philosophy, of deep thinking, of being probed in your being, of living in question. And so to see this person who's both interested in art and the terms and potentials of art, but to link it with thought is very exciting to me. Now, of course, he means thinking as an active activity rather than knowledge squashed into books, even though we're all doing it, aren't we? We're all writing books, reading books, you know, they're not bad things, but we have to go further. Before I talk about some of the key things he says about creativity per se, it's impossible not to talk about this incredible term, art movement, which in a way is his very answer to that first quotation. Thought with totality as its content has to be considered an art form. And I consider his term that he developed, art movement, which he only really talks about in a small part of the book on creativity. And I can't tell you how excited I was. I almost fell off my seat when I first read this a few years ago. He's created an art form, as far as I'm concerned, because of the possibilities this opens up in thinking, but also potentially in cultural form. And when he uses this term, he's really proposing a new metaphysical paradigm. We know that David Bohm read a lot of philosophy, and he's very critical, as are many contemporary philosophers today, of outstanding Western paradigms, which are very mechanistic. In a way, were developed to protect us from this non-human world, to protect us with a God, to protect us with scientific inquiry, and to put us at the center of a kind of command central, where the liveness and the livingness is the human being itself. And everything else is running like clockwork and inert. Important, I don't think these things have ever been seen, the world has never been seen as unimportant, but unwittingly, through a lot of our Western paradigms, we've created this dualism, which I'm sure we all know what I'm talking about: mind, body, individual cosmos, human nature. So he's aware that in terms of any form of newness, any form of potentiality, we have to go and change our very worldview. And as an artist, I've always been quite productive, but I have to be very honest and tell you, I've always also had a struggle as an artist. And the struggle is with sitting in a room or a studio making, which I love to do, when there are so many incongruities and incoherences. And as Dave Bohm realized from a very young child, this could be so different, which was a preoccupation of my own childhood. Not that I understood what that was about, and that's why I ended up being in art, because art seemed to offer an opportunity to do it differently or to help with that. So for that reason, Bohm comes to setting up a sort of new metaphysical paradigm, but he calls it art movement. And as somebody interested in an ambiguous moulding of art and philosophy, it's, for me, it's just radical and outstanding. So he calls it a germ of a different worldview, and movement here is very, very important. Not something that's fixed or imposed, but something itself that has to continually question itself, move and open. And critically, he says, without the need to suppose that there is something that is doing the moving. And this is really a key difference to a lot of truth claims that have formed the previous metaphysical positions. In fact, Bohm says, you know, if you want to develop a healthy metaphysics, a creative metaphysics, drop the claim to truth. Otherwise, we're going to fall back into old paradigms. So rather than this thing of so-and-so is X, we just have to assume that we can never head to final knowledge, but we can be involved in this movement of opening up to knowledge and understanding that doesn't just arise in us. And he says in the second quote, the essence of human life is art, a whole movement in which ends and means are the action of fitting in. It is clearly of key importance to give attention to the fitting or non-fitting of our overall worldviews in the broader reality in which we live. And he doesn't just mean culture and society, he's talking of the cosmos and beyond, things that we can't actually put into words, but we might be sensing or responsive to through our body being, and potentially through our mind, which he says in other places is like a subtle antenna. He's very interested in the etymology of words, and when he talks of fitting like this, he looks at the etymology of art itself and realizes that it is fitting. He's also really interested that the etymology of the good, which is a long-standing philosophical term linked to ethics, means to gather and join. So he's finding these very creative links between art and the good and ethics. And then he finds out in Latin that there are similar roots for the good and for beauty. Whereas art, as we sort of know it today, not necessarily by artists, but by aestheticians, art has sort of become very much linked to just aesthetics. Now, aesthetics is a really rich and broad field, but there is a fragmentation. And so Bohm is really keen to open that up through this investigation. And then the second quote, he says, in this art of life as a whole, we have to be both creative artists and skilled artisans. We are this, always in the act of fitting an ever-changing reality, so that there is no fixed or final goal to be attained. Rather, at each moment, the end and the means are both to be described as the action of making every aspect fit. So that's in a nutshell. I can't do justice to him, but I feed you that small nut. A little bit about creativity. Creativity, by Bohm's own admission, he starts his essay on creativity by saying, actually, it's hard to speak about, because if we're truly being creative, in a way we are perceiving and moving and laboring, really more in symbolic orders or new orders rather than the known order that we have through linguistics and language, important as they are. He's not denigrating those things, but to really work with creativity is to open up to a whole new order. And he says, to sum up, we may say that quite generally, in a creative act of perception, one first becomes aware, generally non-verbally, of a new set of relevant differences. And one begins to feel out, or otherwise to note, a new set of similarities, which do not come merely from past knowledge, either in the same field or in a different field. This leads to a new order, which then gives rise to a hierarchy of new orders that constitutes a set of new kinds of structure. The whole process tends to form harmonious and unified totalities, felt to be beautiful, as well as capable of moving those who understand them in a profoundly stirring way. So when new orders come into being, there is the voyage of the discoverer, as so to speak, but there is also the voyage of the humans who come into an encounter with those orders. And he says, evidently, creation of this kind by us humans has been fairly rare. If the whole of human history, perhaps in the whole of human history, perhaps only a few people have achieved it. The reason is that creative work requires, above all, a creative state of mind. And this sort of links to some of the background work to his model of Bohm dialogue. This notion that the society and the culture we grew up, at least in the West, for all its many obvious richnesses and intellectual capabilities, that we live in an incoherence, that there are huge problems, and often the very problems, because they're set up by the way we think, that's been sort of also fixed by language and is also linked to these mechanistic paradigms that I described earlier, although they work very fluently, they actually hold us back from actually managing to connect outside of our systems of language and knowledge to enable this creative newness to enter our systems. So we may indeed innovate, but often we're innovating through association, or fancy is a word that Bohm borrows from Coleridge. And again, he's not denigrating the notion that he says a lot of art is actually fancy. He's not saying therefore that it's bad or faulty, but he's just saying it's not allowing us at this creativity. Not too many more quotes. And then in Unfolding Meaning, he says, for the present, however, one can say that creativity is not only the fresh perception, and I haven't underlined that enough, and this will come out a little bit more in the artwork examples, perception. This is so hugely important. And as an artist, I feel quite humble because I've grown up in an education of perception through the training you get. That's school, that's training and perception and skill. And then you go to art school and it becomes less about perception. It becomes about knowledge and experiment, all of which are very exciting, but perception can get dropped. So this is really important from Bohm within the arts. And lots of people would agree with me, I'm sure. So creativity is not only the fresh perception of new meanings and the ultimate unfoldment of this perception within the manifest and the somatic, even more it is the action of the infinite within the sphere of the finite. Back to this incredible ability Bohm has to want to work between the particular individual, not the ego, but the particular individual, the living substance, society, the importance of that with its problems and its affordances, but also the cosmic, but all those three. Okay, and then just to end, I'm going to go through some artworks, and not because these illustrate art and movement. I think art and movement, you know, I don't think it's meant to function that way. It's not a sticker. But these are works that somehow touch some of the things I'm interested in and saying. Most of them by men. Sorry about that. It's not because women aren't doing them as well. These are just the right people to choose. And I haven't really chosen any artists alive today, other than there's a piece, a sort of group piece by myself, but we might be hearing of some works by my roundtable guests. So actually there are some incredible contemporary artists I could talk about, but it's just a bit too complicated to do in the time frame. First, I'd like to honour William Blake. I don't know if Bohm ever looked at his work. Blake is just incredible. And again, I'm not going to speak long about these artworks because I think it's hard to do them justice anyway. Interesting with Blake is he combines the importance of technical skill, which is important, and Bohm mentions at one point, technical skill isn't it, it's not art and movement, it's not creativity, it's not a new scientific theory or a beautiful mathematical equation, all of which are part of art and movement, of course. But it's part of the mark, part of the making a structure come into being as a result of a new order of perception. So there's the technical skill, but then he tries to deal with some very important issues. So he's particularly interested in the infinite and the finite, in the human as a microcosm of a macrocosm, and was very critical in a very creative sort of pulsating way about the height of rationality and the Enlightenment paradigm that was around him at the time. And the quote to the side, maybe aside from the word God, could be a quote by Bohm. Here's two other images. What I really like about Blake as well is his imagination, in that he develops not stories, but these new structures that are like new universes. but they're not so wildly different to our own that you can't feel questioned yourself. And critics say that it was part of Blake's concern that he would not only feast your, give you a feast for your eyes with these beautiful, exquisitely tiny images. They're very dense, they really pull you in and sort of suspend you and open you up, but that he wanted you to undergo some sort of understanding through engagement with that work. And one of the figures in his mythology, his mythologized world, is Urizen. And Urizen stands for the very type of paradigm personified in human form that Bohm was concerned about in fragmented society through mechanistic worldviews. And here we see diagrams of the four zoas. These are from his work Milton, where it's an unfinished work. He worked with poetry and images, for those of you that don't know his work, and would work with them together. And then he would develop these quasi-philosophical, theoretical systems. And he himself spent a lot of time thinking about art. What was art's relationship to the infinite and the finite? And this more theoretical philosophical engagement as an artist is something I'm also really interested in. I feel it's a really important part of moving with your art rather than just making artworks. Next, another artist who just, it's the stake in my heart for all the right reasons. I can't put it into words. I'll try a little. James Lee Byers. What's incredible about James Lee Byers is the way he works with his agency as an artist. Part of my practice is as a live artist. And up until recent years, I would only work with live art because I wanted to avoid the entrapment of an artwork and all the attention being taken in a solid object that was taken to be the art, rather than the life form of the artist, the culture that the artist wants to share and participate in, all of which do get enacted through the process of making an artwork. So I would work with the body. Also with live art, you don't work on a stage or in a theatre. You don't work in an established framework. You work in your garden, you work in the street, you work wherever. And James Lee Byers' work was not always to camera. You have this sense of this person weaving an almost magical line through the life he lived in, some of which was in the art world and some of which wasn't. And he would often cover his face. Yeah. Sorry about the yowling, that's not my stomach, that's my cat. She'll just have to wait a little while. Another piece, The Shadow of an Extraterrestrial Man. He would often wear a gold suit. Yes, my love, 1 second. The World Question Centre, 1969. These are not very clear, they're from videos. 1969, a lot of live art wasn't documented, not just because people didn't have mobile phones, but a lot of live artists refused to have their work documented. And a lot of my early work I refused to document as well. He also works with sculpture. Sculpture incarnation of his idea, 5 points make a man. He was really interested in philosophy and opening up what it means to practice with materials and matter and philosophy. This piece is called The Chair for the Philosophy of Question. He felt very strongly that it wasn't about answers, it was about questions and questions that invoke questions. Another artist is Robert Smithson, who's very famous for his earthworks, but actually it's his writings that I think are his greatest contribution. Very much thinking, the writing as an artwork, this notion of the artist writer is really important to artists today. And Emma, who's with us on our panel, is really key, a big inspiration for me with that. So we to work with these things in creativity and art, it's not just about objects or live art, it's also about words, of course. Something I've always said in my own work is, and I don't really understand it, but I think it can come into context. I say art is not viewed straightforwardly as a tool of communication, more as a complex kingdom that is continually attempting to establish itself through human thought and action. And just as examples of my work, I sort of work in aggregates. In my studio, in my private work, I do a lot of drawing and images. I actually am coming round to the fact that a picture and an image is possibly more radical than any other way of working, but that's another story and just part of my evolution. In terms of projects, wherever possible, I try and incorporate using David Bohm's dialogue. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. This is a project I worked on in Africa at a sculpture garden called Nerox. I'm very interested in using sculpture gardens less to make a sculpture and more to question what is thinking with the body, and how does that take place site specifically. Here, before the dialogue, I worked with a young live artist, Jessica Dower, based in Johannesburg, who was an Alexander technique practitioner. And we brought 3 Alexander technique teachers onto the landscape, and the people who came for the dialogue in the morning worked with their bodies in silence and barefoot over the sculpture park. Then we had lunch together, and then we sat in circle and engaged in dialogue in the afternoon. So wherever possible, I try and bring dialogue into the creative process of making a work. And this was a pre-visit for me coming and making a new piece of artwork. And when I returned a year later, I also held a dialogue with a local group working with New Consciousness and the Land. And I held a dialogue with them. And I started to get they lived on the edge of the sculpture park. They were setting up a whole new community. And I got very interested in them as one of the most important sculptures, a kind of moving, living, breathing temporal sculpture on the land. The sculpture park is in the Temple of Humanity, the Cradle of Humanity. Sorry, my cat is yowling. The Cradle of Humanity. And this is where our ancient prehistoric ancestors living in caves, where it's held to be at the moment that we passed into our first consciousness and imagination, and no one quite knows what happened. And the sculpture park is divided up into very tamed, beautiful, lush grounds and sculptures, and then raw felt land with wild animals and caves where these ancestors lived, which I had access to. So I did a piece of work where I took the sculptures as a drawing, as part of a ritual, as a sort of amorphous human living creature back to the cave. So I took the tailored, tamed culture part of the park to the cave. No one saw that. I did go with the photographer. That was a sort of ritual. I worked with grasses. I was reading philosophy while I was there. I use a lot of trainers in my work. I call them trainers of transformation, about the human effort of artistic labor. This is a philosophy work by Agamben, written out on African grasses and put back in the felt. I made a piece of work to bring the cave, the ancient cave, back into the sculpture park as a protest placard, which is meant as a protection, not as an angry statement, a protestation. So this drawing is a very elaborate drawing of the cave that again was like a ritual. It took 3 weeks to draw in an explosion shape. The protest placard is also a book container for a book about the grasses of South Africa. And the title of this piece is very important. For the Cradle of Humanity, what the tough luff grass knows still grows. The piece was installed in a gallery setting, and as if to suggest explosion from the cave and consciousness and links with the past. I wanted this circulation of time. Shards, the equivalent of the shards, were made into huge lead shelves that we put various materials on. Literally, I have 3 more slides. I just wanted to say a little bit about Bohm and art himself. When he talks about artwork rather than art form, and I'm actually far more interested in his use of the word art form, but he has a really beautiful bit where he talks about what art does to us, and this links very much back to perception. And Lee Nichol made this incredibly exciting statement at the end of his lecture in the last summer series, where he talked about the holoflux. And at the end of it, he said that these ideas were a call on us to experiment with ourselves. And it's so, so important. And I suppose artists give themselves more permission to do that. Art school gives you permission to do that, but actually all of us can do that. And Lee's words and of course the work I'm doing in the holoflux course that some of us here today are working with Lee on has really opened me up to revisit in a really kind of Bohmian way of not this linear movement of progression. And he himself said, you know, art progresses, and as it should do, but don't dismiss the past art. Don't be violent. Don't make it disappear. We have to work we have to have a touchstone with it. And so this quote where he talks about his response to The Clown by Roel, who to me is a really traditional artist, and I'm not so interested in images that are painting a clown or the landscape. I respect them, but I'm not so interested. And you can see from the quote that Bohm himself opens up into this incredible experience of open perception where his eye is darting over and there's this close up and pull back that opens up a different sense perception. And it's not just that you then enjoy the artwork. This is not what Bohm's talking about. The brain, the mind itself, the somatic possibilities of the human being are opened up. And I think it's really powerful when he says, and then suddenly there was a different vision in which it seemed there was a circulation in the whole room coming out of the clown and back at me. Incredible how an image and an activated human being, creativity awakened as it were, can do that. Bohm was not against theory, and when he corresponded with the artist Biederman, he said it was very important for artists to decondition themselves through reading theory. At the same time, they should be careful that theory doesn't then condition them. Very astute. And I just have 2 images that have got nothing to do with anything I've said, and yet I could look at them for the rest of my life. So I never go into the studio without looking through my book of the paintings of Giorgio Morandi. And a friend of mine just put this on Facebook earlier, Flowers by Moonlight, Winifred Nicholson. How can something be so full of care? It's not skillful in the technical term, but the skill of perception, the sense of something that I can't put into words that feels physical in me. And it is beautiful, but it seems beautiful far more than what I'd call tight aesthetics of mark making and composition. Leroy Littlebear writes an amazing preface to the Routledge Classic Edition of On Creativity. The book is brilliant. So if you haven't read it, please read it. You need to buy both versions because I also really enjoy Lee Nichol's introduction, that they're both equally important in different ways. And I'm really taken by what Leroy Littlebear says when he says renewal is an important aspect of the Native American paradigm. From the constant flux, Native Americans have detected certain regular patterns, be they seasons, migrations of animals, or cosmic movements. This gives rise to the view that creation is a continuous process, but certain regularities that are foundational to our continuing existence must be maintained and renewed. If these foundational patterns are not maintained and renewed, we will be consumed by constant flux. In the Blackfoot mind, what we know is simply a temporary marking in the flux. And if I think back to the previous work, the need for figurativeness, Bohm is against a representational frame of thinking and imaging as our artists today, but we mustn't lose that totally. And I haven't put an image here because in a way, when I start to consider, for example, just Blackfoot culture, it's so huge and it's so already in the art movement and will have been for a long time that it's just, I'm not the one to say something about that other than, you know, oh, opening, ever open, oh, I'm a flabbergasted, oh, can we all go through that hole, that circle, that point? Can we all receive through that point? And yeah, so that's just a very important thing that I just want to acknowledge, that I can go through this sort of slightly quickened version of Bohm and my interests, and it sort of links to some Western philosophical ideas and Western art, but there are other movements out there that are already holofluxing, but I can't just jump in there. So I'm coming from my complicated, sometimes anal, way, but that's the journey. Oh, come on. Almost there. I think this is the last slide. And lastly, returning to art and movement and Bohm. I'm not going to say what dialogue is because I think a lot of people here know, and a lot of people here also know it's really hard to talk about without killing it. And it is very much a doing, if one that is not so straightforward, and we're never sure if we're doing it or not. I think dialogue is creative in the Bohmian sense. I think it is the creative artwork or art form of art and movement. And yeah, and here are two quotes that I think are really resonant. The first is from Thought as a System. The dialogue is potentially a creative art, namely new orders of necessity may arise if we sustain it. If we sustain a dialogue very seriously, then it becomes possible that there will be something creative and new, which could be a microcosm, the germ, and could then communicate it. In other words, that which appears to be just a lot of meaningless contingency is the field in which some new order of creative necessity might come. And out of that can come a new culture, a new society. And from the Bohm-Biedermann correspondence, I thought it'd be nice to end on part of his letters to an artist. He says, the ideal of human behavior should be that every moment of relationship be creative. People are not really relating to each other freely enough to allow something new and creative to emerge between them. This lack of freedom is often referred to as experienced as a difficulty of communication. But the notion of lack of creativeness is, I think, a more accurate way of describing the trouble. So thank you very much for, I think I was a bit longer than 20 minutes, forgive me. We'll go into the group round table, and all I want to say about my guests is that aside from being some of the most creative spirits that I've met and worked with, that we have all been meeting through dialogue, through something I called Wisdom Special Workshop that I run through Sheffield Hallam University. So there is a shared connection, relationship there. And if we want to start with a pause in silence, that's fine. So James, if we could move to just the 4 speakers, that would be great. Thank you.
think maybe I might begin with a few words. And in a sense, I think it's a response to the rising and falling of sensations that I was experiencing in the anticipation of this event, and also listening to Hester's fantastic talk. And it was around this dilemma of how to prepare, really. I'm not a Bohm expert at all. I've read little bits of Bohm, but not an awful lot. I have participated in some Bohm dialogues, but I wouldn't say that I have done so extensively. But I am interested in my own practice in dialogue as or I would say conversation, perhaps in a different way to from this turning about together etymologically. I'm interested in how that as a format has the capacity to enable us to reach beyond what we already know and to enter into a space of something that's not known and that's imminent and specific and occasional to the conversation. But still, I came back to this question of how to prepare for today. And during Hester's talk, I was feeling quite nervous, actually, and feeling quite under-prepared. So I suppose these questions came to my mind, which was, what does preparation mean? And in particular, preparation for creativity, for a creative mindset. How do I prepare? Am I prepared? And then maybe this kind of morphed a little bit into how am I willing, or how am I available? Because on the one hand, if I acknowledge a tendency that I have in myself, preparation can manifest as knowledge acquisition, getting the book. In fact, today it's quite interesting, through the post, maybe 45 minutes before today's talk, Bohm's book on creativity came through the letterbox, and there was a great temptation to kind of flick through the pages and kind of sort of gen up on the subject, if you like. Or to read through my materials, or to tune into my practice to try and almost like rehearse a sense of what I understand this to be for my own practice. But I know from my experience of dialogue that this is not the route. And actually, if there were a route, it's the opposite. It's to try and let go as much as possible of all of that. And to meet with Jess and Hester and Alison today, and to see what arises from that. But still, these questions preoccupy me a little bit. So I suppose one of the entry points, again, looking a little at the article that Hester shared with us around creativity, written by David Bohm, there's something about this, what gets in the way, that feels really pressing. What gets in the way? If only we could just get out of the way, actually get ourselves out of the way. Creativity would be perhaps a lot more possible. So yeah, thinking about my own anxiety maybe is a bit strong for it, but certainly apprehension about today. This what gets in the way, on the one hand, the need to prove something, and on the other hand, the need to protect something, both of which are ego in a way, and not wanting to look stupid, and not, all of this kind of self-consciousness. So maybe I begin with that as a kind of caveat in a way, a kind of confession of sorts. Yeah, this question of preparedness, and am I prepared? And what does preparedness mean in the spirit of dialogue and in the spirit of creativity?
I would like to say thank you, Emma, because I also had the exact same feeling of nervousness and the exact same question in my mind of how do I prepare for an event where I'm not actually being asked to prepare. And of course, coming from a slightly different place of not being an artist as such, but working very much with creativity in Bohm, there is so much that I could say about my own work or my own thinking, and trying to hold that back to come with that open, curious mind, and that kind of to be in a dialogic state, but then to feel that kind of nervousness of like, well, then I won't have anything intelligent to say. Or, I think listening very carefully to Hester and kind of waiting for the resonance, I think. And it wasn't always there, I think. And because I feel like we so much wanted to be in this dialogic place, but sort of that doesn't always arise when we're talking about like things out there, you know, as opposed to things from here. And so I think, yeah, coming with this intention to just be present and notice, which is something that I think is so essential to creativity, because that's when new things come in, when we're able to kind of hold an empty space to allow new things to emerge. That flow of meaning that is so central to dialogue can only flow if we're open, but that requires us to kind of hold the unknown. And I think that's something that we're not very good at doing, you know, generally in society. And that's the thing I think that most struck me rereading the On Creativity essay. And it was very timely for me, like writing my PhD proposal, is the mechanical mind, that we're so governed by the mechanical mind. It's so unnatural, actually. You know, I find myself often fighting against, especially in the last 18 months, spending so much time looking into a computer and working very hard and being governed so much more by productivity and time, this mechanical mind, you know, that goes against how I would like to be in the world, which is much more attuned to nature, and to a different kind of flow, you know, more the kind of flow that Hester mentioned in terms of the indigenous ways of being in the world, like cyclically. So yeah, I think now that I feel like now we can get into flow, but I think for me, that was so enabled by you sharing some part of your experience that was happening in your body, because it's not just mind. I think it's also like what is happening in our bodies, and being able to share that. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think we've this kind of nervous apprehension, the kind of sense of pressure building up, is where we are beginning, where this dialogue is opening. The preparation, I read the essay, I was sort of underlining every other line, sort of yes, 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 yes. I've written notes about how it relates to my work, but that is nothing to do with, that is a certain preparation. I also went for a walk, talking about flow. I walked down to the little river 5 minutes away from me. I put my hand in the river and I felt that flow. But it's not this actual yeah, I'm not particularly articulate about this, but I'm pleased that Hester in her talk said that it's virtually impossible to talk about. So that relieves me. But yeah, it's wonderful. We now have this view, the four speakers, of just each other. And there's a field, there is a field that is created, and it's about, you can feel it kind of starting to ring, but there's a nervous tension.
I mean, I think it's also maybe to qualify the kind of apprehension or the nervousness or the trepidation or the feeling of unpreparedness, or what kind of preparedness is called for, isn't just unique to this specific situation. It also feels as if it's a condition of many of the critical and creative contexts in which I work. And in a sense, there's a kind of encountering with that over and over again as part of the process. And I guess one of the things I'm not sure about is whether that's a personal deficit or whether there's something of that threshold that is somehow necessary to navigate as part of the creative process. So a lot of my work involves collaboration with other artists, and yeah, that sense of what does it mean to encounter another artist and work with another artist and hope for the possibility of something arising through that encounter, which is neither belonging to me or belonging to her or belonging to them, but is somehow emerging in and through the nature of the encounter that we have. And how, again, if I'm honest, so many obstacles get in the way of that or have to be navigated through before the process can begin. And again, often in my own experience, it comes back to a kind of approving or a validating or a affirming of a history. Actually, maybe that's what it is. It's an affirming of a history of practice. This is what I've done before. This gives me the kind of let's call it even the credentials for being here. And in a sense, I think also this is present in the article, to a certain extent, that history has to be let go of a little bit, that known has to be let go of, or at least there needs to be something about loosening the grip on it, if you like, to allow for something that's new.
It's difficult, yeah, because Bohm, in that essay as well, he also says, which I like, we have to be careful though about also saying we have to look at the unknown. So I appreciate what you're saying, but that also can be a type of conditioning. I mean, the art world's full of everyone saying, oh, it's all about the unknown and the unknowable. And actually you're talking in a very sincere way. You're talking about the space of the encounter and dropping expectations. So I'm not suggesting you're doing that, but I think, not to make it too complicated, but it's not as, I think talking about the importance of the unknown itself can be problematic in this context. I think we entertain ourselves a lot with the notion of the unknown. So I'm not denying its importance, and I definitely don't want to stay with the known. And one of the things I particularly like when I'm in what I call the technical making bit of an artwork, when that bit arrives and I'm ready to make, is that at that point, in terms of the materials, something unknown that I'm not expecting necessarily has to come in, because materials talk back to you that way. It's this, even if you were, I think, painting a mimetic picture of a still life, the materials are continually working with you and suggesting something, but even more so in a contemporary version of making a work. So, and like we want, I'm not asking for difficulty, but it's like, I think, you know, when we look at the way plants grow, or the way, if we look at processes in nature, and Bohm's quite clear that processes in nature and the orders are eminently creative, there is a friction between flamboyant freedom and openness and blossoming and constriction. And I don't even mean just red in nature, red in tooth and claw, and the way that there's, you know, one animal hunts another. I mean, even the way a plant has to grow round a rock, or and it might look quite tortuous, but maybe that plant had a fantastic time over the years, just, you know, having a little bit of an erotic elbow at the boulder. We don't know. So I think one of our problems is that we do avoid the uncomfortable. So I suppose that's what I'm thinking now in response to what you say, that yes to the unknown, but if we're prepared to be very uncomfortable. and I'm not sure how often we are.
I wonder whether, as you're saying that, yeah, there's certainly something for sure that in the arts world, there is a certain rhetoric of not knowing and the unknown, which, you know, I am also part of and contribute to. But as you were talking there, I was thinking, what if we shift the term unknown for the alive? And actually that suddenly felt much more interesting, that I think that sense of letting go of what has been, what's at stake is really not so much the entering into the unknown as entering into the alive. And that's also equally full of trepidation, right? Because you don't know what the alive is going to bring. It's kind of interesting. I'm on a retreat at the moment, and this is a little bit of a break in the retreat, but earlier on today, the retreat is around inspiration, actually. And I was talking a little bit and saying that the rising of inspiration, sometimes in my own experience, I can feel a tendency to try and manage it or even control it. And the image that was coming up in the discussion was like being at the edge of a river, a very strong river that really you kind of want to dive into it, but it's really frightening. Maybe this comes back to Alison's image of putting the hand in the river as well. And where am I going with this? Yeah, and I think there's something to do with standing on the edge of the river. There's a certain stability, and it can be very exciting to look at the kind of the coursing of the river as it's moving past, but to actually take a leap into it, to actually become the river, to become, you know, maybe this is also something to do with, maybe there's some connection here to the movement that you were talking about, Hester, that it's not that a person is creative, creativity moves through the person, but to allow it to move through, you've got to be willing to jump into it somehow. And at times, my own experiences of paddling at the edge, and again, maybe there's a threshold here that's been brought to mind in terms of what's at stake. What's at stake, even between the mechanical and the creative? How do we navigate from the safe banks of the mechanical? Actually, it's a bank of security, stability, routine, predictability. How do we take the leap? How do we take the leap? Because it feels as if it's quite counterintuitive to do that. Yet on the other hand, it's a leap into aliveness. It's completely a leap into an aliveness. So it should be the most intuitive thing to do.
I think it's the hardest. It's going through these wave upon wave of inertia, but holding yourself at the river's edge. It's kind of holding, because when it happens, it's not difficult. It's the most simple thing in the world, because it's down. You know, there's a download, and it's whole, and it's beautiful, and it's that kind of shift from the bank to the inertia, and it can't be striven for, but you can't just not do anything. It's not just letting go, because there's that, as you say, there's that kind of nervous tension, but when it is whole, it's a wholeness, and I think you said it's like a download. It comes through. It's not, well, but I've Eastern thinking rather than Western thinking. There's this idea of wu wei in Chinese and wuji in Japanese, which is the action of no action. That's got something to do with it. I'm not saying that is what it is, I don't know, but it is creative action that's natural, arising. And in the essay, what I really enjoyed was Bohm talking about this kind of natural order of the mind that is, so the opposite, well, what he was saying was unnatural is what we're in 99% of the time. I'm in 99% of the time, which is distraction. So, you know, I always feel I'm kind of flapping on the surface thing. I want to go deep, and there I am. It's like I've got water wings on, holding me up, and I want to just go deeper, not knowing how to. But yeah, he says that the natural order of the mind is that wholeness, and it's not just contained within the mind, it's the whole, it's kind of wholeness, seeking wholeness.
I think for me, listening to the three of you sort of here speaking as artists, and myself perhaps not as an artist maybe today so much, is for me, and Emma, you talk about what's at stake, and so for me, I'm listening and tuning into what is it we can learn from artists and what it means to be creative. And at the moment I work predominantly in international development with people who are desperately trying to solve the climate crisis, and you know, they throw the word innovation around left, right and center, but they never talk about creativity. And we never go to those underlying causes and values and beliefs. You know, everything is the same. It's on the riverbank. It is familiar, it's mechanistic, it's doing what has been done before, hoping. And, you know, Einstein, of course, contemporary of Bohn's, two amazing quotes that the definition of madness is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results, and that we need, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking or level of consciousness that we created them with. And that's why I think dialogue and creativity is so essential through everything. Like, it needs to permeate everything in life right now, because we need inspiration, we need imagination, we need a creative, original mind to get ourselves out of this horrendous fragmented crisis that we have across the globe, you know. And it's that standing on the riverbank, that looking at that moving river, that people are so afraid to do anything new because it's going to break themselves apart, you know, and we don't have the emotional resilience and skills to understand how to put ourselves back together again. And that it changes everything in our very existence and being, like, and we have to be open to that. And I think that's what the artist and that's what creativity allows people to do is, you know, we're still afraid of the unknown, but there's something about the process and being brave enough and courageous enough to go into it and enjoy it as well. I think, like, there's that love of creativity and curiosity, the things that also we see in dialogue, like being curious, you know, like as opposed to being judgmental. So these allowing these new things to emerge is a process, and it's dynamic. And I think so many of us are not in our dynamic process as human beings. We're rigid, we're mechanistic, we like order and control because that's what is familiar and therefore it feels safe. But I think what Bohm talks about in that essay is that we've tricked ourselves into thinking that that's the natural order of things when it's not. Like, we can't recognize creativity and we can't recognize what is natural because we're so governed by this mechanistic narrative and way of being and thinking. And that's what we need to break free from. And I think we will only do that through the creative process. So I think it's just so important.
I think the issue linking to that is the wholeness thing that you bring up, Alison, and I didn't really have time to stress enough in my presentation, because the whole idea of undivided wholeness is so important to a lot of Bohm's ideas, and that undivided wholeness, it's both the whole, but it's also the individuals, the particulars, you know. I don't just mean individual human beings, even though they're transitory and everything's sort of in process, as it were. And I sort of struggle very much with the notions of wholeness, because there's so much gumph around about be whole, you know. I do appreciate where that's coming from, but it's the same thing, using the same language, and that caused the unwholeness in the first place. So there's a sort of real strange, sophisticated narcissism or self-pleasure sometimes going on. You know, blame myself for that as well. I'm not trying to say there's a perfect way of doing it, but I'm just super critical, I suppose, on edge. I don't want to be on the riverbank. I may not be in the river. I may be in some strange cartoon. I'm like, you know, the animal who's run off the cliff and who hasn't fallen in the river, but is just doing lots of movement, suspended in air. And actually, maybe that's not a bad place to be. But anyway, with one of the things that dialogue, when dialogue is really sort of working, when everyone's really attuning, doesn't mean we're maybe, you know, full of wisdom, but you can just feel that thing where things, just the cells of your body and the cells of the air start to connect. That experience of wholeness that way. And what's interesting about that is it may not give you an answer or a specific idea, but it does literally physically feel like that's what my brain needs. And I remember the first time I did a weekend dialogue with the Lancaster dialogue group, who first group I ever came across when I first read the book. And there was a weekend dialogue, and I just remember leaving and a very good friend picking me up. We were going to a Halloween display or something, fireworks. And he said to me, "You must be exhausted. You know, so if you don't want to talk all evening, that's fine." And I was like, I have never felt more open, crystal clear. I have no need to say anything, but I'm like, I'm ready, you know, I'm going to take it all on board. And it was like the way a body feels when you've really done a good run. So that I'm saying it's carnal. It's not just a cultural decision. I think there's something very carnal about that wholeness, where you are taken into account. You know, the muscularity of your brain, the sensitivity of your gut, the problematic of the word, but also the beauty of the word and of the voice, you know, and it's something we get together. I mean, Emma, I know you collaborate. I collaborate sometimes. I'm very much a lone artistic practitioner and like that relationship to materials, but there is something about the working with other humans in that way that's so, it seems important possibly for creativity as well, for creativity to take place in the way that Bohm is talking about.
Maybe looping back a bit to what Jess was saying around almost like feeling not like the artist in a sense. There was something in that kind of resonated a little bit with Bohm's article, where he talks a little bit about how quite quick within schooling we're taught to conform in a way, and that conformity and fear of making mistakes really is one of the biggest inhibitions towards creativity, against creativity. But actually I was also thinking that there's something else that happens very early on in schooling, which is this sort of siphoning off of creativity into specific forms. So creativity becomes synonymous with art, the actual form it takes, the artwork, the poem, and quite early on, I think there's an encouragement that some people have creative capacity and therefore make these various forms and other people don't. And actually, I think one of the things that seems very liberating about Bohm's thinking is that it seems as if it rescues creativity from its relationship to form in a kind of way, and realigns it much more to the notion of force, creativity as force, as a kind of an operation, as a power, actually. And this is interesting because I think there it becomes much possible to explore the capacities of creativity in everyday life. And in a sense, I think that idea of the artist, I mean, this is also the interest in my own work, that being an artist or working in an artistic context is convenient, or it provides a good context, if you like, for exploring certain things which are less possible to really dig deep into in other contexts of life. But at the same time, I think the art world has its own limitations, which are not to be under acknowledged. You know, I think actually it would be very possible to say that many artists aren't actually truly creative. I think many artists work very much in that kind of mode of the mechanical, even though they are, you know, creating art forms all of the time. The sense of the known and the repetition of the known, I think, would be very much part of repertoire, actually, which I think is so common in the art world. So there's some interesting things to dispel there. I think on the one hand, not all artists are creative, and on the other hand, creativity is not really only to do with the form that it takes, but actually a force that everyone has the capacity to access. It's the river again, maybe. We can all jump in the river, right? And that feels quite liberating, actually. I don't think that's taught enough, actually. I think that would be a big interest, you know, that would be an intervention to really teach creativity at an early age, separate from specific forms. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is so resonant. Or it's like poetry, you know, to think that dialogue allows us to go beyond the form to the force. And you know, I did actually go to art school. I went to art school for a whole year because I left because I didn't think that I had anything to make art about, you know. And I was one of those people that was put in the category at school of, oh, you make nice things that look nice. And I knew I hadn't lived enough, and I hadn't developed my creative original mind. I could make stuff, but there was that, you know, I didn't have those skills that you're just saying we should teach, and we so should. And now I've gone full circle, you know, but like this, not straight, to really feeling that creative force and working with it, not just in myself, but with other people, and being able to show people that they don't have to be creative in that conventional sense of what it means, but that we are all creative, and that we can use making and, you know, draw at so many types of creative expression to understand ourselves, to relate to each other, to understand the world. And that also shifts our perception, I think. You know, something that's so important to me is how we relate to the natural world, and the language that so many people use around the natural world as like weeds or overgrown or ugly or vile, you know, this very violent language, which is reflected in actually how we are treating the natural world, and many people, in the Western world, that is, of course, not Indigenous people. And that when we become aware of that use of language, and if we can have the artistic creative perception to see things as beauty, you know, to see a little thing that you might call a weed as beautiful and part of a thriving natural ecosystem, that natural order of things and our interdependence and interrelatedness of it, and that wholeness, then, you know, then it sort of feels like it's falling into place. And I think just one more thing I'd like to bring in the kind of topic of wholeness is Murray Bookchin in his book on social ecology talks, I don't think, it's not his phrase, I can't remember who he borrowed it from, but it's a unity of difference. So he was very against holism as this kind of we're all one, because he says, no, look, we're all different. But with that, there's a unity and this kind of equality of the unequals, as opposed to thinking that we're all equal. Which I find really powerful. And I think dialogue as a process allows us to see that we are all different. We have different experiences that give us different, you know, worldviews, but through dialogue, we can bring that kind of cohesiveness and coherence and shared meaning together in that whole for that period of time, and something new may emerge from that wholeness. So I think it's that process of being able to like put things together and listen and look at things from different angles that you do as an artist, that that force, that creative force can emerge in the dialogue process as well.
I'm thinking at this point that it would be, because I was longer in my presentation, and because of time, and I don't want to cut my beautiful people short, but there are people outside the four of us who've had the presentation and heard some of what we said. It'd be really great to open it up back to everybody. You may have a question to any one of us, that's fine, but I mean, I just want to encourage people, it may be something you want to add to what's already been said. Please don't feel you just have to link it to something already said. Feel free to, of course, but there may be things you're thinking of that you think are very important and inspiring and interesting, and of course you may disagree with things, that's also absolutely fine. So I don't know if there's any questions or things people want to say, but can we at this point, would everyone be okay if I open it up?
Yes, of course. Let's open up to everyone then. As I said earlier, to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom. Some of the reactions at the bottom of your screen, or you can physically raise your hand, and if I spot you, I can ask a question. Or if you're feeling shy, write your question in the chat and I'll read it out for you. I think the first person to raise your hand is Lloyd.
It was me.
Thank you, James, and thank you for this presentation. And a word that is always like nails on a chalkboard to me is understanding. And that came up several times today. And as I explored indigenous wisdom, what occurred to me is that what I had understood by understanding, I see as this Western conceit that given enough information, we can understand anything. And in light of the conversation today, it seems to me that understanding, in fact, may be a barrier to creativity, because understanding is pulling something out and saying, here it is, this is it. And what you shared with us, Hester, from Bohm's thinking is that we can never do that because it's always in motion. And so for me, it was very freeing to be able to give that up. And I don't use the word understand at all anymore. So I just appreciate, comments from anyone on that. And also one thing that helped me with that is some years ago, I read a commentary on, actually it was just a paragraph in a book talking about Darwin. And the writer, and I don't remember who it was now, maintained that when Darwin was talking about survival of the fittest, what was actually meant was that which fits most harmoniously into its ecosystem. So I am complete for now. Thank you.
Who wants to, does anyone have any comments on what Lloyd just said?
Wow, there's so many hands up, isn't there? Actually, maybe I was just going to add one thing that's come up also around this understanding in various collaborations has been to kind of split it with a hyphen. So it becomes more like an under of standing. So there's something that is to do with sort of kind of a dislodging or a going underneath of a position taking. So almost like an underfronting. This is, as you can tell, a little bit ill-formed, but somehow to rescue understanding from acquisition of knowledge and acquisition to something that's much more troubled and unstable, I think is very interesting.
Thank you, Emma. Next question will come from Mary.
Great. I just so appreciate this, and I want to bring in a couple of concepts. One is that of power dynamics, and the sense that when we talk about unpreparedness, there's a certain way that I can feel unprepared, but other ways that I might be prepared to engage in a kind of a powerful way, or I've internalized that as a powerful way as well, compared to some people who don't feel so prepared to be on an equal playing field, or aren't welcomed on an equal playing field, or perspectives that aren't, experiences that aren't. But my main point right now is that my sense, I get kind of galvanized to bring in trauma and trauma patterning into this conversation. So we're not assuming some kind of pristine, even if we're saying it's in the moment and it's opening to the aliveness, that we're not assuming that that won't touch into places that are really messy, that aren't beautiful and aren't rational, that are instead a very, very wise response to traumatic experience. And I think this is on a collective level so primal to our human condition, and so primal to our human crises right now, that it has to be incorporated, that there's a wisdom in the trauma pattern, there's an ethical rupture that needs to be paused and noticed, and then from there something else, something deeply adaptive can emerge, but avoiding that is going to avoid those deeper responsive possibilities, and that the creativity that I'm really interested in, I think this all can be part of, is to set the conditions so that all of that can emerge, and listen collectively, and feel and share somatically the ripples of others' experiences and of the Earth's experiences, and thereby come to something really, really potent. And I think that's what we're referring to, but I would just want to put those, I mean, the panelists, but I just wanted to put those parts in as well, power and trauma patterning.
Thank you, Mary. Who wants to try and answer?
It's not really an answer, and especially because I thought it was a beautiful, important placing of something. And Bohm is very direct when he says, when we, for instance, open ourselves and enter into dialogue together, we should be prepared for precisely that to come up, and not in order to boot it out the circle, so to speak, but it's like, until you really are honest about where we're at, where Mother Earth is at, where whatever comes into focus, attention, is exactly where the work is. Dialogues can often have very rich, interesting content, but for me, that's never a marker that it's been a good dialogue necessarily. And actually, there's a kind of energy exchange and including release and stuff like that, that somehow ekes its way out, as well as, I really do think this notion of creative intelligence as arising from elsewhere that we somehow attune into. I experience that sometimes in dialogue too, but I don't think you can even we never get there anyway, but I don't think you can even move first centimetre towards it unless there's that honesty of really, you can't speak of creativity without admitting where we're at as a species or as a human, and you know, I think Bohm even writes somewhere that the state of our Western culture, at least, is traumatized. So yeah, just I think it's very important what you say.
Thank you, Mary and Hester. Next comment will come from Sharon.
Thank you, James, and thank you, panel. I'm actually responding to something that you said, Lloyd, about this notion of understanding. And to me, understanding and knowing that I'll never understand all that there is to understand go hand in hand, that there's not an endpoint to understanding and it's not a static place. In fact, if I were to say, what is my life about? My life is about trying to understand more and more and more and more and more, not in the sense of reading a lot of books or anything like that, but to be able to continually perfect, also understanding the process of perfecting, also understanding that perfection is impossible for me, but perfect my instrument such that I'm able to perceive more and more of what is, as best I can understand that, of what is true, of what is so, is what is, you know, what is, you know, here and beyond us and all of that. And to me, that's understanding. I mean, an effort at understanding. And that is, you know, it's mutual with, you know, understanding that I will never fully understand. And that's why I keep going, right? That's what it's all about. So I don't think there's a dichotomy there, actually. I think that it's a process and an aspiration.
You want to build on that?
I'd just like to pick up that idea of the being, the human being, as an instrument that the last speaker spoke about. A kind of, yeah, if we sense ourselves as sensing instruments, ever. I mean, this wholeness is never whole. It's not a kind of static wholeness. It just invites more and more and more and more and more. It's that's maybe, yeah, the more we open as, yeah, I just love this image of as instruments. And of course, the more that is offered into the dialogue space, the trauma, the inertia, then the wholeness expands to include, but it is a kind of porousness that can just let more and more in. So I'm just, yeah, I'm kind of, I'm resonating, feeling like a sensing instrument, and knowing that other people are equally. It's great, it's wonderful to be in a space where a sensing instrument amongst other sensing instruments, which are pulling things in. It's like messages kind of pulling things in from out, from maybe it's this creative intelligence Hester mentioned. It's using the richness, the grotty, you know, the grotty kind of trauma, not necessarily grotty, but it's the whole earthy felt material, and then hey ho, this wholeness can include that as well.
I felt compelled then to kind of quickly have a little cheeky etymological look at understanding online. And it was interesting that on the one hand, I think it has got that kind of connotation of comprehension and grasping. But on the other hand, there's this sense of standing in the midst of. So under not used in the sense of beneath, but really more from the perspective of among or between. And I think, yeah, that idea of understanding feels really resonant. I think this idea of understanding as a being in the midst of, maybe what you were talking about a little, Sharon, as well, this kind of in the process of, and one of the things I was struck by in the article was this sense of, I think, if I recall right, the idea of the natural order always changing, always restructuring, always generating new forms of structures. And I think that kind of sense of understanding operating in the middle of that, and this kind of sort of fields of intelligibility coming into register and then disappearing again or becoming restructured, I think feels it feels as if it's full of potential as a way of rethinking understanding away from knowledge acquisition or the stabilizing of understanding into fact, I suppose, really.
Thank you. We'll take the next comment from Sky.
Hi, everybody. So nice to be part of this communication. And so my background is in physics. I've been inspired by Bohm for 25 years since I was in college, and trying to understand the implicate order and develop a science of the implicate order. And what I want to circle back to, which has been talked about quite a bit in the end of the dialogue here, is wholeness. And I think wholeness is a really important part of the underlying angst that we're feeling spiritually as a global community, the sense of being disconnected from each other, even disconnected from our own hopes and dreams. And what's really interesting that I think comes out of Bohm's work on wholeness, and the hologram is a big influence for me, the visual of a hologram, is filtering. And our glasses are an example of a filter. Our glasses change what we see in order to help us see it better. But some filters change what we see in order to see it according to our own inner beliefs and concepts. So I'm curious about, one of the speakers before brought up grief or trauma, and and the nature of the things that stop us from really seeing what the wholeness of a situation is, or the wholeness of what someone's trying to communicate to us. When someone communicates to us from their experience, we often hear our own experience, not their experience, and it stops us from really communicating. So with this sense of limiting the wholeness of the world through our own perceptual filters, and it makes it hard to really express and heal the sorts of traumas that we're carrying. So do you feel, and can you speak to the importance of, and the process, our ability as a human family to work through discrete opportunities to actually heal grief, to actually heal miscommunications amongst each other in order to create more access to the wholeness of who we are together as a human family? Thank you for the chance to speak and hear from you.
Thank you, Sky, for your question. Would you like to comment on that?
I'd quite like to pick that up. I think I'd just like to offer an example of using creativity and a creative process to allow people to kind of notice those lenses that they don't also see through. But I think listen, Bohm talks about the lenses that we also listen through as well. So we see and listen. It's this sensing instrument that we are. It comes in many forms. And then just one thing that came to my mind was I was doing a workshop on the feminine principle, and we were looking particularly at power. And I use Lego serious play sometimes, so it's using Lego to kind of build models to tell stories. And so we'd asked our workshop participants to build a model to show a time that they felt disempowered. So quite a sensitive topic, you know, it could bring up a lot of things for people. But one thing that was really powerful in that is that one person said by building that model and looking at it and having that distance from it, it made them completely shift that memory of that experience for them. And I think that's the power of creativity, is that we are making something new that can replace or reform or reconfigure ourselves and our past memories and thoughts and feelings and experiences, and open ourselves up to new perspectives and new ways of thinking about ourselves and the world around us. And I feel like, you know, that's the power that we you know, that creative force that we can kind of tap into. Yeah, I think what you said is it's so true, that we're not seeing the wholeness in the world because we've shut so many parts of ourselves off. I would say one other really powerful process is nonviolent communication, you know, to be able to really understand your feelings and communicate your needs and connect to them. It's just so important.
I was going to mention Marshall Rosenberg. Yeah.
Love him. Yeah.
Big connection.
Yeah. But of course, like he said, some people, like you brought up, you know, you can't hear what the other person is saying because you yourself have not received enough empathy. So then we get stuck in a bit of tug of war sometimes of like not being able. But I think that's when if you bring something creative in, it's another way to receive, because it allows a bit of separation. That's very powerful about kind of model building, is that, you know, I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about this model. So then you get that little bit of separation you need to allow new things to kind of come in. So that can be really helpful.
Thank you, Sky and Jessica. Next comment will come from Andrew and Yuriko.
Hi, I just want to quickly throw in 3 thoughts. First of all, about understanding. It could also be understood as substance, to stand beneath or below. Mm-hmm. And it's the basis of Spinoza's worldview, dual aspect monism. It is Deus sive in natura, God or nature. That is the unknowable domain, very similar to Bohm's implicate order. So I think understanding seen that way subverts dualism that we're all trapped in. Second thing, I wanted to pick up on Alison's remark about Wu Wei. I think it was Marx that said that art should be a hammer, not a mirror. I think art should be a window. I think art should be a window. I'm not music is my thing much more than visual arts, but I know when somebody is acting as a window and their ego simply isn't getting in the way, something bigger than them is coming through them. And the third point was about all this talk about, do I stand on the bank? Do I jump in the river? Which do I do? And it's also picking up on what Emma said about maybe we should talk about the alive rather than the unknown. And I think I quote this every time I contribute to a Barry dialogue or seminar or whatever, but Shantaina, I don't know if Shantaina is even here today, but Shantaina in the Eranos I Ching, in his foreword, writes these wonderful words, and it just makes me think of the river and the bank. Life itself arises at the boundary between order and chaos. It requires both. It is a daughter of both. On the side of perfect order, there is only dead stability, inertia, symmetry, thermodynamic equilibrium. Nothing very interesting can happen there. Everything is too predictable. It resembles death more than life. That sounds a bit like standing on the riverbank to me. But the side of total disorder is not very interesting either. Forms appear and disappear too quickly. There's a total lack of symmetry. Everything is too unpredictable. It is on the edge between order and chaos that the subtle dance of life takes place. Here the real complexity arises. Here forms bend and loop and transmute and evolve. So one of our mechanistic thinking traps, totally related to dualism, is either or thinking, and perhaps we need more both and thinking as well. That's it.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. Anyone have a comment on this? Well, we'll leave it as it was. It was very good, Andrew. Thank you. We'll go to Mike next.
Okay, thank you, James. I just, I think in reaction to a question Lloyd raised about understanding and knowledge, he triggered me to remember a French poet, Paul Claudel, who spoke about what I think is a scholastic term, connatural knowledge, and which he broke down to mean connaître, which is kind of birth with, or to know is to go through a process, or to understand or to know is a process of being born, of affecting a kind of inner change, which at the same time involves coming into a realization of a very different kind of world than than kind of what you're used to. So this process of knowing is itself a process of transformation, and one suspects that you can link this ideas of Claudel to Bohm's understanding of the implicate order, because beneath our ordinary action, it's the implicate order that is constantly emerging and that is carrying us along, speaking of the river, and which brings about moments of realization, which amounts to a series of birth. And I just wanted to say that it's very important to understand, and to, I think, understanding in this Claudelian Bohmish way that something's always emerging, and that as a result of that emergence, we are being born, and that we're meeting constantly a new world in very significant ways. And that also is very much the essence of art.
Thank you, Mike. Anyone? Any comments?
I'd quite like to comment there. It's quite. I mean, what you just said there is, shows us how we are and how we perceive, in this case, to the word knowledge or understanding, completely changes what is possible. You just showed that. So that's very, very powerful. And you don't have to, but I'm interested in how you ended it. And you said that's what you think the artist is, because it sort of links to what Emma said at the beginning when we did our little round table, how to get ourselves out the way when we are the way, because it's that thing, if we get ourselves out the way, then there is no world. Well, there is a world, but so we do need to get out the way, but at the same time we have to we are part of the movement, we're not separate. And what you're talking about, the way you brought it across just then, you were really implicating us as the knower rather than the commander, whether it's of knowledge or unknowing, or the riverbank or the river. You suddenly had us more in a kind of
non-dual,
and totally non-dual, where we're still part of it. So, and I think you're right. I think there is an art, or shall we say, because I'm hesitant for people to think that the artist has to be someone like me who's been to art school and makes things. So maybe there's an artistry here, or I know we could potentially all be artists, but I'm slightly wary of saying everyone an artist. I appreciate the sentiment, but in the, just like scientists, I'm flawed by their mathematical beauty, and I know that I'll never feel and understand certain things they talk about because I haven't been mathematicking all my life. I sometimes wish I had. So as an artist, that way I work with materials, I've been doing this since I was literally 3 years old, you know. That doesn't make me special, but there is a discipline and a practice to being an artist. But artistry, or being creative, or being an instrument of creativity, Alison, I love what you say there. That is something that's discipline specific, if that makes sense. But would you like to say more?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to something you said earlier as well. And that is, we need to put this in, I hate to use the word structure, but perspective maybe is a better term. And that perspective you mentioned, when I think you were speaking of an artist who was speaking of the individual, the social, and the cosmic, which Bohm was, and you're making that point. And I think this brings us to the question of an ontology of creativity. And that notion has been left aside, but the Russians have worked a lot on that, you know, from the turn of the century forward, for people like Berdayev, people like Solovov, and so on. And I don't think, you know, that as Westerners, we really connect to those thinkers. I think, you know, maybe Whitehead, maybe Bergson, so on, but I think that they were thinking in very large terms here, as was Bohm, about the cosmos as a whole, about our place in it, and the only tram that kind of took us there was creativity, which had a promise of making us fully alive and fully involved and full participants in this cosmos. Does that make any sense?
Yes, and really important, because you also break us out the dichotomy of Western paradigm, indigenous paradigm, and yeah, I'm excited by what you say, yeah, I think that's very important. Yes, and also in the way that I really like the way that Bohm wants us to create these new orders. But in terms of the arts, he's also saying, yes, decondition yourself, be philosophical and thinking about art, and make and open yourself up to materials and new orders, but don't destroy the past. And I think there's a lot of effort, I'm sure in scientists too, but I can only really speak of poets and writers and artists, particularly at the turn of the century, who were engaged in really radical experiments of creativity that really did expand into the art of life. And I don't think that can be too neatly pigeonholed as a past epoch. I mean, you know, the war came along, a lot of things came along, and then our way of canonizing art history has tied certain ends up and missed really radical experiments that included the free open subject within it. So I really hear you, and but I haven't done enough. I haven't encountered those Russian creatives you talk about. I don't know if you want to put those in the chat, that would be great, because maybe people would really appreciate. I know I would.
Yeah. I just like to say one more thing. I'm sorry, but there's a link here between art movement and holo movement.
Yes.
And I don't think that that's been strongly enough made here, because they're in the end versions of the same thing.
I totally agree. Other than, I suppose, what I like about the art movement is more clearly figured in that is the human.
Mm-hmm.
Holo movement, we are holo movement, we are in it, it's of us, but I also, but this is just me and my understanding of it. Well, understanding, completely the wrong word there, forgive me, there's the language habit. They are linked, but I can't use words for that. And I don't know if Lee, I'm desperate for you to come in and help at that point, because you're thinking and working so much with holo movement and all of these things, but I don't want to force you. But I really feel you're in a position to say something far more
Agreed.
Than me.
Please come. Yeah.
Well, just to support what's been said, that the link between art of movement and holo movement is, it's so organic and innate that I wouldn't even say that they're linked, that they're just variations of the same thing, really. And that art of movement, when Bohm brought that out, it's at the time that he himself was more clearly formulating the holo movement. So they're really phases and aspects of one thing. And it's great. Is it Mike that brought that out?
Yes.
It's really great that you brought that out, Mike, because to see those two really as one stream, as one flux, the art of movement and the holo movement, I think that can help anyone who's interested in Bohm to really drop a few notches deeper into what he was trying to convey if you experiment with art of movement and holo movement as phases of one thing. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I just say that I think it was Hester who brought up about being a 3-year-old. And I think we're looking at a little boy here, David Bohm, who was trying to cross a stream without getting his feet wet in order to get to school, which was the stone stepping exercise that gave birth. And I underline that word, gave birth within him to this notion of holo movement, which means that there is a knowledge that is occurring spontaneously and without thinking. Because if you think, you're going to get your feet wet. That this is a very important dimension of reality, that this little boy going to school has, we have to think, what was in his mind? What effect did that have on him? It influenced his physics years later and has such a profound influence on us as we have this conversation. So 3-year-olds and children, let's bow to for the moment and say, remember Claudel being born, this idea of knowledge as being born. That idea was born in him, if you can call it an idea, through that experience, very simple human experience.
Well, thank you, Mike, for sparking that very interesting conversation. But unfortunately, we're over already. So unfortunately, we should close the Q&A. I'm really sorry for those who did want to ask a question, but we might have an opportunity tomorrow. Just before we close, I was wondering if Hester or the other panelists would like to make any final remarks to close, something to bring back with us from this session.
Oh, I'm not very good at closing. And I'm full of what's just been said. I'm sorry for people that didn't get a chance to ask questions, and feel free to add something in chat if you would like that, so that everybody sent that to help people carry on with their concerns and thinking. I'm really grateful, and I'm really grateful for my 3 round table guests. So I don't know but I don't want to put any of you on the spot, because I don't want to sum up or conclude. I want to keep this right open where it's at, to be honest. But please, Jessica, Alison or Emma, if there's something you'd like to say at this point, please do.
I think maybe one thing I would just say was thank you for the invitation, Hester, and thank you for the opportunity to join you all. What a delight, actually. I'm very used to working more in an artistic context where creativity is talked within the sort of the frame or the perspective of that. And I'm just struck by how different the conversation emerges, or the dialogue emerges even in this particular framework. Yeah, it feels very special. So yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Oh, sorry, Alison, did you want to, were you about to say something?
Yes, I would like to say thank you too. And that, you know, there's no way we can sum up or kind of, but I'm still kind of ringing with everything that's been put in. And I'm sure these kind of ripples will, you know, they will continue. The kind of, yes, that kind of vibration and ripple will, yeah, we can't just kind of close it down, put a box on it, even though we have to end. So thank you.
I would just like to say, yeah, also a huge thank you to Hester for the invitation and to everyone here. My heart is hurting a little bit to Tom and Lynn, who've had their hands up so patiently the whole time. I don't know if you feel that you have something so necessary and vital to say. I would love that we could give you maybe just a bit of space to say it. But other than that, yeah, it's been a real honor, and there's so much that's been shared that I will go away and continue to reflect on and think about on. But yeah, Tom and Lynn, are they allowed, can they contribute?
Of course they can. Yes, of course they can.
Yeah, go on.
Tom, did you want to come in, Tom, and say something? Tom Small, would you like to say?
Yes, please. First of all, of course, thank you all. This has led to a very meaningful meditation, I think, on my part. And I do have a comment in response to Hester's exposition of David Bohm's notion of art form rather than work of art. One of my most wonderful encounters with an indigenous artist was with a man named Jeff Grignon, the regeneration forester for the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, who introduced us to the phrase, the Menominee phrase, Napano Pemichwan, meaning flows repeatedly. And that notion, I think, of a kind of Bohmian flux stays with me. And another thing that stays with me is the reading list that Jeff provided us with, which was headed with William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and went on to a work by John Gardner on the art of fiction, and a book on writing poetry. And what I came away with was this sense that Jeff Grignon practices forestry as an art form, as an artist, not just as a person regenerating the forest, but in his phrase, working on the edge of order and chaos, the circles within circles of the forest and the trees, where the greatest creativity occurs on those edges between one kind of system or one circle of mother trees and their offspring and the next circle. That edge between order and chaos is where the creativity emerges. And that's where the art of forestry emerges. And I think of also another experience, Leroy Little Bear, in a provincial park in Canada that contained a lot of ancient petroglyphs. And the petroglyphs were fading, and the Blackfoot elders were asked what should be done about that. And their response after considerable consultation was, let them fade away. And the Red Little Bear meditates on that, and he says, well, the petroglyph is an art form, but it's a very ephemeral response to an experience. And the real art form is the experience itself and the listening to the voices of the wind and the stones and their interaction with one another. And so I come back to that notion of the practice of art form, which is different from the object. And I think that's part of Bohm's point. And I would love to hear Hester's or anybody's response to that if we have time.
Thank you, Tom.
Well,
Who wants to go?
I won't respond for long, so I know we're going over, but I think it's really important that Jess made that call. And if anyone needs to go, please go. And Parry, thank you, because as ever, you're generous and beautiful. Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say your voice and how you put that out there, Tom. It's hard to know to say anything because, you know, you just placed a lot of very important things there. So because it's reading Bohm that made me think of this difference between the form and the work. So it's just really good that you feel that too. And it's going to have an impact in my own practices, both in terms of making and being a human being. But I don't know if anyone else, I'm just conscious of time and more interested to hear the people who didn't speak yet speak, but thank you. Unless anyone else is, I don't want to stop anyone who now is full of something very important to say in response to Tom. I think you get what I mean.
No, of course. I mean, if someone wants to reply to Tom, go ahead. Or maybe, yeah, that was it. Thank you, Tom, for your question. And yes, we managed to get you in. Yeah, so it's been a really great session. I'm really pleased about how today has gone. Thank you so much, Hester, for your presentation at the beginning. It was really beautiful, and some beautiful artworks that you put forward. Thank you to all of the panelists, Emma, Alison, Jessica. It's been a really interesting discussion. And thank you for all the people who've asked their questions, everyone who's contributed. This has been really amazing. Thank you all for joining us. Just before we go, I'd just like to invite you all to tomorrow's session of Beyond Bohm 2. Tomorrow we'll be exploring imagination and participation, a Bohm-Barfield nexus. This session will be led by Lee Nicol, and he will be joined by myself, Hester Reeve, and Mark Vernon. I also would like to remind you that we have Sutra, our online forum, is available. Please let us know if you haven't received that link to join. Sutra is a great way to share our thoughts about these sessions amongst yourself, but also for the speakers who have provided or will provide additional material to the session. So please let us know if you haven't received that invitation to join, and we will help you out. Again, to contact us, you can use our website in the contact us section, or write us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or just email us directly at james@parrycenter.com to contact me, or eleanor@parrycenter.com to contact Eleanor. Thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon here at the Parry Center. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Goodbye all.